Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabarty. We are coming to you live today on Monday afternoon. Today is September 23rd, and we are going to be diving into all of the biggest headlines from this past Sunday in the NFL. Week 3 is not quite in the books. We do still have 2 Monday night games tonight that we will be touching on tomorrow, but as for now, we are going to dive into all of the most surprising and most impactful outcomes from yesterday's games. We're going to be starting off with the Sunday Night Football matchup between the Chiefs and the Falcons, which saw the Chiefs squeak out another win to advance to 3-0. So we'll be diving into that game. Additionally, we will get into the Baltimore Ravens recording their first win of the season after being able to hold off the Cowboys and a late fourth quarter comeback there. We will then be talking about some of these surprise 3-0 teams. We have the Pittsburgh Steelers under Justin Fields are now cruising up to this point, and we'll talk about what the implications of that are in terms of the starting quarterback job there, as for when Russell Wilson returns and whether or not this is sustainable. And then additionally, the most surprising team, in my opinion, up to this point has been the Minnesota Vikings, who demolished the Texans yesterday to advance to 3-0 there as well. So we'll be touching on those, and then we are going to wrap up the show by talking about the Carolina Panthers, who after benching 2023 number 1 overall draft pick Bryce Young, after what has been a very tumultuous year and 2 games up to this point for the offense, Andy Dalton, the veteran, of course, comes in there and leads the Panthers to a massive offensive outing and a win. So we will be diving into that as well. But before we get into all of that, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. To any of our viewers, be sure to use the live chat to give us your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports as we try and make this show as interactive as possible. Whether you have a quick comment or a thoughtful question, we want to hear what you have to say. And if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can use the super chat button that is available on YouTube by clicking the $. If you leave a comment along with a tip or donation, your comment will pop up on screen for everyone to see. Or you can go to the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker, that is gsmcpodcast.net, to do so. Same as there as well. Anything would be very greatly appreciated. It seems like it's almost business as usual for the Kansas City Chiefs, who are off to a 3-0 start. This is a team that the majority of people picked to win the Super Bowl coming into this year as they try and pull off this three-peat. And, I mean, they've been tested in 3 different games up to this point, coming down to the very end. Some crucial referee calls, which obviously, especially when you're talking about the Chiefs, sort of bake into that conversation. But either way, they pulled out all 3 games up to this point, and even if it hasn't been perfect for them, they are, again, getting the job done, which is really all at this point Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid could really be asking for. Now, we'll start off with Mahomes here, because I do think it's starting to be a real conversation as to the offense overall is still getting results for them. They score 22 points in this win against the Falcons. They are already up from their points per game total from last season. Again, just 3-game sample size, but 27 against the Ravens, 26 against the Bengals, 22 against the Falcons. All things considered, that is fine results in terms of scoring output, but Patrick Mahomes still hasn't really looked like himself up to this point. He has 4 interceptions through 3 weeks, a couple of those being, I specifically look at the one from the Baltimore game and the first one in the Cincinnati game, that they were definitely just bad interceptions. Last night, not a great one either. And we are just seeing sort of a lack of explosiveness still from this passing game. And that's even with Rashee Rice, who has emerged, I think, confidently. We've been talking about it these past couple of weeks. I think that at this point, you have to consider Rashee Rice a legitimate wide receiver one option. Last night, he was incredible once again. 12 receptions for 110 yards and a touchdown. Him and Patrick Mahomes just seem to be on the same wavelength. It's sort of a combination of, and I talked about this before, that Rice has almost taken over that Travis Kelce role, where at times it's just get in the middle of the field in those intermediate routes and just continue to make plays after the catch, with which Rice is doing so. But we're also seeing him on the perimeter. That touchdown pass that he had in week 2 against the Bengals, just running down the sideline, Patrick Mahomes hitting him perfectly in stride. There seems to be a real connection there, and we saw Rice down the second half of the season last year for the Chiefs really start to take on this role, and it has just continued into this season, which is a huge plus there. That being said, though, still sort of a lack of depth right now, and the Chiefs definitely feel better positioned that as the year goes on, they can add to that, as opposed to last year where you just never knew if there really was all that much upside for some of those other targets. You have a Xavier Worthy who was very quiet in this game, just 2 catches for 17 yards. He had the mistake in that fourth quarter that sort of let the Falcons remain in the game. That it was the 3rd and short play where Mahomes was looking to Rice, and Rice just stopped running on that play. Announcers touched on it a little bit. Kind of seemed like Rice just had the mentality, I'm going to find open space and I'm going to sit there. Got to finish through the route there, but those are sort of rookie mistakes, and Worthy hasn't necessarily emerged as a downfield target yet, which is something that I do feel like the Chiefs are going to continue to work on behind the scenes with them, while also trying to make sure that he gets his touches. He gets 3 carries in this game. If you're a fantasy football owner for Xavier Worthy, for example, I mean, he is going to get opportunities, but he's still just not all that ultra refined as a wide receiver yet up to this point. And outside of that, really the big conversation here is that Travis Kelce has been, for the most part, a non-factor this season. Now, this was his best game yet, 4 catches for 30 yards, but that's obviously not the Travis Kelce we have come to know over the past handful of years, and I've been pretty adamant up to this point that it doesn't surprise me that Kelce is getting less of a workload at this point. He's now 34 years old at this point, 34 years old, turning 35 in a couple weeks at the beginning of October. But at this point, he sort of understands that it's about more so picking his spots, that he is a tight end on the older side that isn't quite, an extremely durable position throughout history and as you age. So I'm not surprised to see less of a workload there, but just quite to the level of an ineffectiveness of passing to Kelce at this point, I think does sort of garner some red flags. Now, I sort of, we were all sort of, at least to some degree, noticing this during the regular season last year, and then he ends up taking it to that next level with over 300 yards and a few touchdowns in the Super Bowl run. So I'm not going to fully declare him washed yet, but his value, especially given the fact that he is really just not anything of a blocker at this point. His effort, I mean, he can put himself in positions. There was specifically a screenplay right out of the gates in the second half where you just see he does not have the same drive as those other tight ends, like the top echelon ones, like a Mark Andrews or a George Kittle, to actually finish through on these blocks. And blocking is something that goes under the radar for a lot of NFL fans. But, at a tight end position like Kelce, I do think it's worth bringing up because it sort of separates the fact that he is not being a receiver like he typically is, that he's not bringing a whole lot of value because he doesn't really care for blocking like that right now. And again, I excuse him because of the fact that he is sort of probably trying to preserve himself a little bit for the playoffs. But it's definitely a very strange phenomenon that's going on because Rice has 110 yards, Kelce has 30, and nobody else on the team is really all that big of a threat from a receiver standpoint. Now, Juju Smith-Schuster did have a touchdown last night. Maybe that's something. I mean, I think that play went down right after it was an injury to one of those other wide receivers, and it does go to show that Juju as a fourth wide receiver, I'm not huge on him as a Patriots fan myself. I saw what happens when you sort of throw him into being a main part of the game plan. That being said, though, he is a good depth wide receiver there for Kansas City, and he's familiar with the system because he was with them during their Super Bowl run in the 2022-23 season. So all things considered, it's not hopeless there. I think that Worthy and Juju and Kelce are all people that you could maybe envision having a little bit of a bigger role as the season goes on, but still something that is maybe somewhat of a cause for concern, but I've probably already spent too much time on this because I do actually, before we move on to the Falcons, I do want to give some credit to Carson Steele. We talked about what's it going to look like without Isaiah Pacheco. Carson Steele was basically able to provide a very similar skill set of just ground and pound up the middle, get a handful of yards, stay ahead of the chains. 17 carries, 72 yards there. Thought it looked really encouraging, all things considered there. But yeah, and I do want to get to the Falcons side of this because the Falcons are the team where, the Chiefs can win or lose games in the regular season. It's not going to drastically change our opinions on them. The Falcons have a lot of proving to do up to this point, and it still hasn't looked great with them. I mean, obviously, it's an incredible Kirk Cousins-driven touchdown drive that was putting together at the end of that Eagles game on Monday Night Football, but there's a good chance that, you can definitely make the argument that should have never been even available to them anyways. Don't want to dive into that all of a sudden now, but, the Falcons, they do feel still pretty lackluster offensively, and that was the case for the majority of what we saw in the first 2 weeks of the season up until that game-winning drive, and didn't feel all that much better about them here. Now, credit Steve Spagnuolo, one of the best defensive coordinators in the NFL. The broadcast was hitting on it all night. They were trying to take away that outside zone and the run game with Bijan Robinson, and Robinson had maybe his least efficient game on high volume up to this point in his career. 16 carries for 31 yards. He did have a touchdown, but all things considered, the Falcons got very little out of that run game, and that's when it puts the pressure on Kirk Cousins, who is a fine game manager at this point. But I do think that at this point in his career, he's kind of somebody that you can't get into too many obvious passing situations, because then once opposing teams start to crank up the pressure like Steve Spagnuolo was on some of these key moments of the game, that you see Kirk Cousins still doesn't necessarily have that level of mobility. There was specifically, as I was mentioning, a blitz that ended up getting Kirk Cousins just off of his game, and they didn't even really have a chance at the play because the pressure was brought and Kirk just sort of had to throw it away immediately. That took place in the fourth quarter, and then there was a third down earlier in the game that stood out to me as well, where Kirk Cousins had what seemed like all day sort of in the pocket, but he doesn't have that quick motor, that quick twitch, and nor should he. It's very understandable that he doesn't, but to be able to escape the pocket and make things happen there, again, sitting in the pocket all day long, sort of had the scramble lane if he wanted it earlier, but hesitates, and then by the time he actually did decide to make the move, he was pretty easily tackled for a sack there as well. And it might have been Onyemata for the Falcons, who's been a little bit of a revelation there. I just wanted to give a quick shout there, I suppose. But, all things considered, I think that this is a Falcons team that, again, if you can stay ahead of schedule, that might just be enough. If you play good defense, with which I thought the Falcons did, and they have been up to this point, through 3 games. The other part of it, though, is you got to have smart coaching, and Raheem Morris is somebody that I have a lot of belief in, but I really did not like the decisions on that final drive or two to sort of try and close out this game. It was 22-17. There were a couple fourth and short situations where, I thought it was a pretty well executed couple of plays where the Falcons it was 3rd and 2 or something along those lines with just a few minutes left, that offensive coordinator Zach Robinson called 2 consecutive play calls. So they went up to the field, they ran the ball first time, didn't get anything. They immediately had that next call drawn up, and they end up hitting Drake London over the middle for the first down there. And, that's refreshing coaching. You look at this as a Falcons team with so many weapons that last year, frankly, with Arthur Smith, was so poorly coached from an offensive perspective. But again, I can give props there, and I think that I've seen a lot of good things, especially from Zach Robinson, the way that he's getting the ball in the hands of Bijan Robinson in different ways and such. But that being said, then you look at Raheem Morris after that fourth quarter, that fourth down conversion. A couple plays later, it's 4th and 5. At that point, I would have taken the points, knowing that if you get another defensive stop, a field goal wins the game for you. Now, they mentioned on the broadcast, the analytics said go for it. I just feel like we see too many coaches being too smart for themselves. I would say that about Sirianni in this game, in their game this week as well against the Saints in terms of those fourth down decisions, and then going back to the Monday Night Football game last week. But I thought that this was a situation for Morris where it's 4th and 5. Your offense really hasn't looked that great. And you can use that as an argument for, well, maybe they can't get back down the field like that again. I don't really see it that way. I feel like the Falcons, and they did get themselves back into the red zone the next drive, but they end up not getting the 4th and 5. And then once they do get the ball back pretty quickly after their defense forces a 3 and out, it leads them to need a touchdown to win the game, where, again, I don't like playing the hypothetical game. If they end up kicking that field goal instead of not getting on 4th and 5, different field position, maybe the Chiefs call the game differently. I think you take the points there, set yourself up in position to trust your defense, which is the strength of your team, and then you just need a field goal. And ultimately, I just think that Raheem Morris got in his own way a little bit, because then they do get to 4th down once again on that final drive, and I hated the play call, the run to the outside like that. I just feel like there were a number of times on Sunday that we saw coaches on these 4th and short situations bring the ball even further away from the line to gain in order to make up for it. It's just not the way that I would do it, but also, what do I know necessarily? But I thought that was a little bit of a tough moment for Raheem Morris. But let me know if you disagree in the comment section, as we do have a chat here from Shots Below the Belt. Patrick Mahomes has become a villain in the NFL, sort of like how Tom Brady was. The Chiefs used to be exciting to watch, but now all they do is just enough to win. Can any team in the league take them down? Well, I'll say that too, because you're right. Chiefs definitely a villain at this point, which is why when some of these games come down to ticky-tacky calls, listen, there was a missed defensive pass interference on the Falcons on that 3rd down right before the 4th and 5 that they didn't get. And especially coming off of last week, where against the Bengals, they did get a pass interference call that was of the same degree, if not less than what the Chiefs got away with this weekend, that everybody just likes to sort of point to collusion. And obviously, there are cases to be made that the league is better off when the Chiefs are good, but I don't like to go down that route too much. I don't think you win and lose games with the referees, but, that's just my opinion. But to the question of Shots Below the Belt here, can any team in the league take them down? I mean, all 3 of the teams that they've played so far have given them what feels like their best shot to some degree. I mean, it's taken 3 close games pulling them out. And my answer to that would be no off of the gates here, because I think that the Chiefs are probably the best roster in the NFL, if not, the 49ers, but they're definitely up there. You may be making a case for the Lions as well. The AFC, I mean, there are teams that are capable of doing so. I think the Ravens are capable of it. I think the Bengals are. The Bills, we're going to have to see. I'm really curious what they look like tonight now that they are going to be out without their top 2 linebackers. I think Taron Johnson, their nickelback, is also going to be out. I know he was at least questionable the last time I checked. And it is a situation where, they have a very depleted defense, but Josh Allen, as much as, yes, he makes a lot of stupid decisions, he is talented enough that, any of those teams, I think, can make things interesting with the Chiefs. The reality is, though, you also need the defense to be able to stop Mahomes when the game is on the line. Last night, the Chiefs actually got away with... actually, now that I mention it, this is 3 straight games where, even after losing L'Jarius Sneed, the Chiefs defense has been the one to close out the game, and it's been very close. There have been penalty calls or missed calls that have played a factor there, but either way, still, you can't beat the Chiefs if you don't know how to stop Patrick Mahomes. And as much as I spent the first half of this segment here talking about the shortcomings of the offense up to this point, I do feel like by the end of the year, they can click enough like they did in the playoffs last year. And that's where teams are going to win or lose games. Can you shut down Patrick Mahomes? And I don't know if I have a great answer in terms of what teams are capable of doing it. I think there's those 3 I just mentioned in the AFC. The Lions and the 49ers specifically are 2 teams that I do still think are very talented and are capable. I'd maybe throw a dark horse of the Packers in that conversation, but that's kind of what you're looking at, I feel like, at this point. I like a bunch of the other teams. The Texans, are a good team. Eagles, even though yesterday was a little bit messy, a good team. But it's the Chiefs league right now. They are the team to beat until anybody knocks them off. And we're 3 weeks into the regular season, and we still have not seen that yet. But I mentioned the Ravens as one of those other elite teams that have a chance. They were winless up until yesterday, where ultimately they were able to hold off a Dallas Cowboys comeback. That was a game in Jerry World, a big statement win there. And I want to dive into the specifics of why I was so encouraged with the Ravens game plan, especially yesterday, and why I think that it's something that can be a recipe for success moving forward for the Ravens. So we're going to be diving into that, but before we do so, we have to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube. Absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're now going to be diving into what ended up being a thrilling game between the Baltimore Ravens and the Dallas Cowboys. It did not seem that way for a good while there, as the Ravens did jump out to a pretty substantial lead in this game. They were up by 22 points headed into the fourth quarter before the Cowboys made things interesting, and ultimately, again, Ravens do pull this one out by just 3 points, but a lot harder than it had to be. We'll sort of talk about the Ravens and their ability to close out games in a little bit. But really, the story of this game, in my opinion, was the Ravens returning to form, and that was establishing the run game and dominating there. Last season, they were far and away the best rushing offense in the NFL, and it seemed like through the first couple weeks, they didn't really have that same punch to them. Now, a lot of turnover in the running back room played a factor in that. Last year, they were relying on the likes of, J.K. Dobbins didn't play all that much for them, but it was him. It was Gus Edwards. You had Keaton Mitchell, who popped onto the scene for a few weeks there, and those are all guys. Mitchell's still on the roster, but still dealing with that season-ending injury that he had last year. All of them are gone, and then you bring in Derrick Henry. And the thought process is that Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson are going to be an insane two-man combination in that backfield. But John Harbaugh seemed pretty adamant on the idea that they were going to not have Derrick Henry be that very heavy workload running back for them anymore, and that those days of Henry being that are behind him. Well, yesterday showed that he is still very much capable of doing so, where the Ravens as a whole totaled 274 yards on the ground, which is ridiculous. 151 yards from Henry, another 87 from Lamar. You got Justice Hill, who he was averaging 6 yards per carry on limited attempts, but overall, it was an excellent showing. Like I mentioned, Derrick Henry, this was really his first game fully immersed into being a significant part of that Ravens game plan. 25 carries, 151 yards, 2 touchdowns, was involved on a screenplay as well that picked up 23 yards. We got the first Derrick Henry classic stiff arm of planting a defender while in a Ravens jersey. We've seen a number of them in the past, but it was early in the third quarter. It was Kalen Carson, defensive back for the Cowboys. He got a whole face full of Derrick Henry's arm and then saw nothing but turf after that. Just always so much fun to see Derrick Henry sort of put guys. It's his version of putting a guy on a poster, is just planting them into the ground. And he capped off that same drive in the third quarter with a 26-yard touchdown there, breaking it out to the outside. So showing off a little bit of acceleration there as well. And I think that is definitely who the Ravens should be hoping to be. They ran the ball 45 times and passed it just 15 times. It's not that Lamar Jackson is not a capable passer, but this has been the recipe for success for Baltimore when they've had their best seasons in these past couple years. It's leaning on the run. And again, Lamar Jackson, I do think, is developed enough as a passer that when you need him to make plays through the air, like he did on that third down on their final drive where he was able to connect with Zay Flowers out on the right to, sort of help seal that game, that he's capable of doing so. But the Ravens play best when they are controlling the time of possession. They're running the ball. They're wearing down the opposing defense. And now you get a bruiser like Derrick Henry that's available to you. That's just something that I think is too good of a recipe to pass up on. Not to mention that there was some noise in the NFL community these past couple weeks, but especially after this past game against the Raiders, about how, the offensive line isn't of the caliber of last year. They lost 3 important starters from last season heading into this year. But I do think that this was, a really good sign for them that for starters, the entire offensive line for the Ravens played the entire game. It was specifically at that right tackle position before Patrick McCarry and Roger Rosengarten were sort of splitting snaps more. Not sure if that was due to injury, but I thought that they looked a lot better up front. And it's something that they are going to need to lean on. But as much as this is praise for the Ravens offense, which again, I think that that's the right way to go about it. Shots below the belt in the comment section here says that feels like Lamar Jackson shrinks in big spots. Up to this point, he has. So ultimately, there are still questions to be answered for the Ravens, but at least I feel like they're on the right track. But to the second point of your comment of what's wrong with the Cowboys, for starters, that defense is nowhere near as impactful as I was anticipating it to be. Because, the Ravens, like I mentioned, 274 yards on the ground. That is a bludgeoning. And then you look at last week as well, where the Saints rushed for 190 yards on the ground. And some of that is based off of the game script and the fact that the Cowboys let themselves get into holes early. But and still on the defense, you got to make the stops there. We've seen a number of different defenses in the NFL so far. Just talked about the Chiefs in the last segment. I would argue that the Bears have been kind of screwed over by their offense on a number of occasions, but they still continue to play really good football. That's not an excuse for the Cowboys. You got to set the tone early, and they have just done the opposite of that up to this point, through these first couple games. And we're going to talk about the offense as well, and Dak Prescott, who I thought was, fine. He definitely wasn't great. Some of the throws in the fourth quarter were good, but I thought he was very inaccurate for a lot of the game. But on the defensive side of the ball here still, I do feel like this is kind of to be expected to some degree that they can be pushed around up front. We've talked for a couple of years now the fact that they have been pretty untalented at that linebacker position. During the mid-2010s, that's when you saw a couple of the big-time players for them, Sean Lee, early on, Leighton Vander Esch. But since then, it has been a pretty lackluster linebacking core there for them, and I think that that's really coming apparent. Now, they signed Eric Kendricks in the offseason, which, is an upgrade over what they had, but at this point, Kendricks on the older side, on the latter side of 30, that his best years are sort of seeming to be behind him. They're very reliant on this draft pick from 2023, DeMarvion Overshown, who I wasn't really familiar with him coming into this season. Now, he's somebody that there's a lot of tape out there to feel good about him, but also I still feel like he has a long way to go. He's not fully rounded out as a high caliber linebacker. I feel like he's still not great at the point of attack necessarily. And I think that there's just a very clear way right now to move the ball against that Cowboys defense. Add on top of that as well, that I believe they have allowed just 8 incompletions between the past 2 weeks. Now, part of that, again, game script, the Saints and the Ravens, neither one of them were passing a ton based off of the circumstances of just trying to protect the lead. But the secondary has not really been there yet. Now, Deron Bland is eventually going to come back for them in a few weeks now. That can help shore some things up. But I still think they're going to be vulnerable on the ground. And they are losing the line of trenches battle on both sides of the ball, because the offensive line as well for Dallas has been getting pushed around. Now, this is a tough defensive front in Baltimore, but you are just putting so much in the hands of Dak Prescott right now, who I do think is in that top 10 quarterback conversation. But that being said, it's a fringe top 10 quarterback with really just one wide receiver and not much else going. Now, Jake Ferguson did play in this game. He actually churned out some pretty good results for them. So that's something to at least feel better about moving forward for the Cowboys. But even still, I just feel like they're so one-dimensional, and I don't even know how great that one dimension that they have is, that I think this is a significant problem for them. And I'm not really sure where the reinforcements come from. I mean, you have a name like Brandon Cooks, who caught you a touchdown in week 1 and is, somewhat capable, but not a lot of playmakers on the perimeter. Running back room is very much lackluster, where 16 carries for 51 yards is what they were able to get in this game. The O-line getting pushed around. Left tackle Tyler Guyton, who they drafted in the first round. Again, tough matchup against the Ravens, but I think that Guyton has looked to really be struggling these first handful of weeks, and I'm just not really sure where the next gear comes from for the Cowboys. I suppose it would have to be that defense gets shored up a little bit more and they can start to at least let the Cowboys offense hang around games some more. But you look at the past 3 losses for the Cowboys. We're talking this week against the Ravens, last week against the Saints, and then the other loss coming at home against the Packers in the divisional round or in the wild card round. And I bring those 3 games up, including the playoff game, because it is this weird limbo a little bit in terms of how much criticism can you give to the Cowboys offense. Dak Prescott, you look at the stat line, overall it's fine. 28 for 51. That's not a super high rate, but still threw for 379 yards and 2 touchdowns. But in each of these 3 games that I'm referencing, the defense has just gotten basically smoked out of the gates, and it is so demoralizing. It takes the home crowd out of the game because all 3 of these recent losses have all been in Jerry World. And ultimately, I think that Dak Prescott is a good quarterback. I stand by that statement, but it is a little bit of a tough ask for him. And also, it's a tough ask for him because it's a tough ask for a lot of quarterbacks to sort of win you a shootout. Now, ultimately, the defense did sort of come around a little bit more in the second half for the Cowboys, but I think it's a tough ask to win a shootout. But that being said, I just don't know if Dak Prescott is totally cut out for that. Like, if you are in a close game, I think he's good enough that he can make big plays and big moments for you. But it's not like he is going to be the type of quarterback that can put the team on his back and carry you through a game where your defense just doesn't show up out of the gates. And that's why you look at the $60 million extension. I have, traditionally been on board with you just got to bite the bullet and pay the quarterback. If they let Dak Prescott walk after this season, they have no plan for that offense. That I do think that there are concerns. But you also now look at the fact, well, this is what happens when you pay so much money to a quarterback. You're gonna have a less talented offense around that. Now, also, I think it goes to the front office a little bit because there's just not that much talent as a whole. Other teams find a way to draft talent and insert them into big enough spots, and Cowboys just really haven't gotten that type of production from all that many players as of late. Obviously, CeeDee Lamb is from, the 2021 class that he obviously was able to pan out for them. But outside of that, 2020 draft, for CeeDee Lamb. But, there just hasn't been really all that much support outside of that. And it's not like they've been heavily invested in free agency, or it doesn't feel like to me that they're mortgaging a ton of draft picks to be able to move up. They just haven't really done a great job of that internal development. You got a couple players on defense, Trayvon Diggs, Deron Bland. Those are nice wins for you. And then I guess a little bit in the front 7 as well that, you have some contributors, but overall, the lack of superstar talent or not even because they have superstars. They have specifically CeeDee Lamb and Micah Parsons. Dak Prescott, wouldn't call him a superstar, but he is a more than capable starting quarterback. Outside of that, it's just getting some of those middling players to fill in the gaps. I don't think the Cowboys have done a good enough job as of late, and it's really costing them. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section on this one. We are going to be moving on now to a higher note here in what is an undefeated Pittsburgh Steelers team after 3 weeks under the start of Justin Fields. It's been really encouraging to see him sort of find his way back into a prominent spot here. And I want to dive into, the game specifically against the Chargers and just overall where the Steelers are at in terms of the quarterback competition, because Russell Wilson's still out there hoping that he's going to get a shot when he returns from injury. We'll be diving into whether or not that is a realistic possibility and all of other things concerning the Steelers at this point. So we are going to dive into that. But first, we have to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we are now going to be diving into what is a very encouraging start for the Pittsburgh Steelers, where a lot of people, I wouldn't fully throw myself in the conversation here, of a lot of people counted the Steelers out. Now, I did have them as an 8-win team, so below 500, probably not a great idea by me for betting against Mike Tomlin of getting that 500 record or better. But here the Steelers are out of the gates 3-0, very encouraging to begin this season. But what has been, a little bit of an audible headed into this season is the fact that Russell Wilson has not been available as he deals with this calf injury, and Justin Fields has emerged as a real potential go-to guy for the Steelers for this season, and TBD on the future, but somebody we talked about before, sure, the Steelers would love for Justin Fields to be able to emerge as a franchise quarterback, and we're seeing week by week him getting, more trust from the organization and from the coaching staff. Now, this was a game against the Chargers playing Justin Herbert, who ends up leaving halfway through the third quarter with a re-aggravation of that high ankle sprain. So it's not like there was, a huge, opposition in terms of an electric offense that was going to put up points on the board, that they could sort of let Justin Fields deal a little bit more and take the training wheels off. And, it was hit or miss there to some degree. Did have a touchdown, also threw an interception, but both of those coming in the middle of the field. And that's what I want to focus on here for a quick moment, because I went back and I looked at Justin Fields' passing chart from week 1 and just looking at, what the Steelers have allowed him to do week to week. And if you go on Next Generation Stats and you look at the passing chart of Justin Fields in week 1, I've never seen anything like it. 0 passes over the middle of the field. Everything is sort of close to the line of scrimmage outside of those 2 long passes to George Pickens, but everything pretty close to the line of scrimmage on the sideline. Not putting the ball in the middle of the field in harm's way where there's more traffic, and just sort of had him, keep things as simple as possible. 0 throws over the middle of the field in week 1. Then we saw week 2, a little bit more of the Steelers dipping into that middle of the field action. 6 passes. He was 4 of 6 then. And then Fields threw 11 passes in or around the hashes this past week in the Chargers. And like I mentioned, that includes an interception that was a very poor read, unfortunately for him. Just was trying to throw it to check it down to, I forget exactly who it was, but it was just 0%, open in that situation, and tried to force it in there. That wasn't a great one. But he also delivered a strike to Calvin Austin in the middle of the field between a couple different defenders, and Austin ends up breaking it for the 55-yard touchdown. And I really do think that touchdown that sort of sealed the game to some degree at least is where Justin Fields won the starting quarterback job moving forward. Because now at this point, Steelers are 3-0. I think it's extremely difficult, especially when you're talking about a quarterback competition where the franchise itself has very little loyalty to either of the options, considering they're both in their first season, both coming from out of house. Russell Wilson was there first, and I do think that is the main reason that he came into this season, or came out of training camp specifically, as the starting quarterback before that injury occurred. But, they're both kind of in phases at this point, Fields and Wilson, where there's a lot of TBD. Neither one of them have been, eye-poppingly great through preseason and in training camps. That it seemed like they were just sort of going to lean on the guy they gave their loyalty to first. But at this point now, with Fields being 3-0, the fact that they did sort of take the training wheels off a little bit in this game, letting him throw over the middle of the field and having him, come through for the most part, I think that is sort of a sign that the Steelers feel like, okay, this is somebody that we can build an offense around, that we can trust him to maybe make some of these more difficult plays than we initially thought. And again, when you're talking about being 3-0, that just messes up the mojo. Last year, we saw them opt to go with Mason Rudolph down the stretch of the season because the offense was just feeling themselves that much more down the stretch. That was coming off of Kenny Pickett getting injured. I feel like, you're comparing two quarterbacks that are sort of mediocre, or at least have played mediocre football so far at the professional level in Kenny Pickett or Mason Rudolph. I thought that Pickett was slightly better, and the team definitely would have preferred for Pickett to steal the job back, but ultimately, this Steelers organization at this point really isn't looking to be any sort of charity case for, up-and-coming players trying to develop. They are hungry. Mike Tomlin is hungry for a playoff win. We've been, doing this dance since 2016, waiting for the Steelers to be able to have good enough quarterback play to win you a playoff game. Is Justin Fields there yet? Not totally sold on it necessarily. I think he's taken, a lot of steps in the right direction up to this point through the beginning of the season. It's not perfect. It's also not a perfect offense, I might add as well. As much as the Steelers are now 3-0, I still don't think that there has been a super convincing win yet on their schedule, where week 1 against the Falcons, that is a good win to go into Mercedes-Benz Stadium like that and be able to pull that one out. But you do it without scoring a touchdown. Then week 2, you win 13-6 against the Broncos, who did look better this week, but, playing a rookie quarterback, and it was really more so just relying on that defense. This game, you beat the Chargers, where you get one half and a little bit of Justin Herbert, who, even still, I think we saw it especially once Herbert was out, this offense for the Chargers really just is not all that talented, that you slow down J.K. Dobbins. They've been owning the line of scrimmage, but if you can win that line of scrimmage, I still don't think that there's a ton that can hurt you in the passing game for the Chargers, where, Quentin Johnston looking a little bit better, 3 touchdowns in the past 2 weeks, somebody that, was really clowned on last season after having a bad rookie year, but, may be able to pick himself up a little bit. Thought that Ladd McConkey in this game showed a couple of, moments of really good stuff, and, is having an all right rookie season. But, overall, I don't think that this Chargers win is a great one necessarily. And I still don't feel like they've necessarily planted their flag, showing that they are to be taken seriously as true contenders. Now, playoff contenders, absolutely, they are there. They're in the mix, as they are always in the mix. Last year, they were in the mix, like I mentioned, with Kenny Pickett, Mitch Trubisky, and Mason Rudolph. So they're always a very well-coached team. Their defense is absolutely elite, but I do feel like eventually we're going to need to see the offense sort of take that next step, and I think that the offensive line is a real problem for them. They just lost their right tackle, rookie Troy Fautanu, for the rest of the season. Now, Isaac Seumalo is their offensive guard, their left guard. He is yet to play yet, so he's somebody that can, help upgrade them to some degree, but I don't think it's looked great there. The running game was struggling for a lot of this up until really that second half where Justin Herbert went out, because the Chargers, from that point on, the entire second half for the Chargers, it was 4 drives, 3 3-and-outs, and 0 total yards. That is a horrible position to put yourself in if you are the Chargers, and that's where their defense was on the field basically the entire second half. And that's where, if you run it enough times, eventually you're going to get worn down. And that's kind of all the Steelers need to do to some degree. And, Justin Fields wasn't necessarily all that much of a part of the rushing attack in this game. Did have a rushing touchdown himself, but, you know what? He was airing the ball out a little bit more, which I think is a good thing. I have no doubts in my mind that Justin Fields can be a contributing factor in the run game. It's really just, is he going to evolve as a passer? And up to this point, he's looked pretty good doing so. So I think there's a ton of positives for the Steelers coming out of this. I still think that they are far from a flawless team. And that's where, you look at the Ravens picking up their win last night. Can't wait for, that's going to be a very gritty matchup there, as the AFC North matchups sort of always are. But, that's going to be a game where the line of trenches, the line of scrimmage is going to be a war zone for sure. So, we'll see there. The Bengals should be able to, win pretty handedly against the Commanders tonight as well. I still think that those are the top two teams in the AFC North, but the Steelers are at least inserting their name in the conversation here. It's like you just can never write them off, and that is, one of the biggest rules for, the NFL is as long as Mike Tomlin is there, they're going to be in the mix for 500, and up to this point, 100% of the time they're going to get over there. Still wouldn't, guarantee that this season that they're going to be a 9-win team. But again, 3-0, it's a great start for them. And you have to obviously be feeling great about that defense. But to sort of wrap a bow on this whole thing, I don't want to glaze over the fact that I do feel like this is now officially Justin Fields' team, and we'll see from there. Now, as I sort of highlighted as well, I do have sort of a fair amount of doubts about the defenses that they've taken down, that they really haven't had to overly rely on offensive scoring. I mean, you're talking about a team that's yet to top 20 points, and they are 3-0. That's not extremely sustainable. And it's not like Justin Fields he's been very, very fine, very solid up to this point. Still hasn't had a great game yet, I would say, but I feel like that's partially also on the coaching staff because they've wanted to sort of ease him into this, which is, you're talking about taking a player who was just with the Chicago Bears, who was sort of thrown to the wolves through his first handful of years. I can understand and really respect, trying to build an offense that is favorable for your reclamation project quarterback, and it's been good up to this point. So, this upcoming week they are going to be in Indianapolis, which is a pretty tough place to play with a pretty good defense. So I think that should be, a nice test. On the other side, Anthony Richardson, he's probably going to be seeing all kinds of nightmares with that defense. So I still feel like, the Steelers have a pretty winnable schedule from here on out, all things considered. Once you get into the divisional games, it's the second half of the schedule is just messed up for the Steelers because week 11 and on, it is all divisional opponents, and then the out-of-division opponents are the Eagles and the Chiefs. So it's going to be very tough down the stretch there, but you see the Steelers have clearly been working Justin Fields into this role through the past few weeks that I think, he has a really good chance of succeeding. I'd love to see them be able to try and find another receiver, somewhere out there. Might be too late for that, but, all things considered, I think that there's, again, it's a lot of good that's come out of Pittsburgh so far, but I do still feel like there needs to be a little bit more proving of themselves. But, if you are fully bought in, let me know why in the comment section. We'd love to hear it. But we are now going to be moving on to another undefeated team, and a team that I definitely did not anticipate to be here. I don't know how many people did, and that is the Minnesota Vikings, where just yesterday they dominated the Houston Texans to remain undefeated. So we are going to be diving into that game, talking about the play, of course, of Sam Darnold, and giving praises to that organization as a whole, because I think that, the way that they have built up this roster needs to be looked at in depth because, it's been an entire team effort up to this point for the Vikings to be here. So we're going to be diving into that. But first, we have to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, wanna be the greatest. Everybody on their fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news if it's solution shit is stupid. If you choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as I now want to dive into what has been an incredible start to the season for the Minnesota Vikings. Could not ask for anything else up to this point. It seemed like this was an offseason that was headed in a very tough direction. Now, I love Kevin O'Connell, and I do think that, again, there is a good infrastructure there, but you talk about sort of some of the off-the-field stuff, with, Jordan Addison getting arrested, J.J. McCarthy tearing his ACL. Unfortunately, of course, the passing of one of their draft picks as well. That I do feel like this is a situation where, the Vikings could have come into this year with, bad vibes and just sort of fallen by the wayside. But I think that it almost is even more of a credit to Sam Darnold, who, even if all of the other surrounding factors are not going well, Sam Darnold, somebody who has that energy and that fire to go out and get it, is so important and crucial to the entire team as a whole. And, there's another situation in Carolina there that we're going to talk about in a bit where I think you can make a little bit of a similar case. But Sam Darnold, in a situation where he understands this is probably, if it doesn't go well, his last chance to prove himself as a starting quarterback in the NFL. And he has been phenomenal up to this point in the season. And, you look at 3 games here, completing 68% of his passes, 657 yards, 8 touchdowns to 2 interceptions. And it has been really incredible to see this rejuvenation from him. And there's parts of his game in particular, like you look at the mobility and elusiveness from him in the pocket, the way that, the first touchdown of this game against the Texans was him being able to avoid players, scramble out to his left, and then find Justin Jefferson in the end zone. That, you're seeing a lot of really good pocket presence from him. This is, by the way, the same Sam Darnold that, while mic'd up on Monday Night Football, said that he was seeing ghosts. Like, that same guy is now, being able to properly navigate a pocket, sense pressure when it's coming, and make the adjustments necessary to do so. He has been nothing short of excellent up to this point, at least, relative to expectations is really the caveat there. It's not like he's looked, to me at least, like the best quarterback in the league, but he is fulfilling his role as well as anybody else in the league is at this point. And he ends up with this game, 181 yards and 4 touchdowns. Looked great there. But I do feel like there's a couple different things here, and I want to circle back to Darnold to sort of cap things off here. But I also have to give love to the remainder of the team as well, because I think that it has just shown to be such a well-run, organization, and specifically just the functions under Kevin O'Connell have been so great for them up to this point, where you end up going and getting an Aaron Jones at a discount who's been excellent for them up to this point in this game. 19 carries, 102 yards, adds another 46 yards in the air with a touchdown there. That's somebody, again, when you talk about instilling belief and inserting that fire in a situation where it seems like nobody really, they are the nobody believes in us team up to this point. And to be fair, I still don't totally know if I believe in them in terms of being a playoff team, but I've been thrilled with what I've seen up to this point. And Then you also have, of course, the star power of Justin Jefferson. That offensive line is one of the best units in the league. And additionally, defensive side of the ball, I mean, this front office as well, they went out and they spent on defense during this offseason, bringing in a Blake Cashman, an Andrew Van Ginkel, and a Jonathan Grenard. Grenard, by the way, he had revenge on his mind. He definitely had that fire going up against his former team in the Houston Texans, where he went out and recorded 3 sacks in this game against his former team. I mean, just excellent stuff from him and this defense as a whole. I think that Brian Flores deserves a ton of credit as well. Now, the Texans were without their top 2 running backs in Joe Mixon and with Dameon Pierce, but it's still a talented team. And CJ Stroud has looked, just so composed up to this point in his career. And they forced him into 2 interceptions, which is the second time of his career up to this point that he has thrown multiple interceptions in a game. They were getting pressure on him all game long. Seems like Flores was pressing the right buttons in terms of when to bring pressure. Obviously, very blitz heavy, but now he also has more faith in the remainder of his defense to be able to settle in as well. That you still have, veterans in the secondary. And this is overall, again, I'm just blown away with the results we've seen up to this point. And I think it is an entire team effort. Now, again, I guess very quickly here on the Texans, like I mentioned, they were shorthanded in this game, and that's definitely part of the reason, but they just kind of got all outclassed, like top to bottom here. And CJ Stroud, again, I have, the utmost faith in him moving forward, but we saw him rattled in this game. We saw him, making some bad decisions. I don't blame the first interception really on him at all. It was tipped at the line of scrimmage and popped up into the hands of one of the linebackers. So, I think that ultimately nothing that you need to fully panic about, but a game that they should be able to bounce back from. But even being a little bit shorthanded, to be able to stick it to the Texans like this, and the Texans were in the game for a while, and the Texans, I will add this as well with them, just been way too messy up to this point in the season, where you look at Laramie Tunsil, their star left tackle, one of the highest paid tackles in the NFL. He ends up picking up 5 penalties in this game. That's just, really unacceptable, but I'm sure they know that. I'm sure they will be able to bounce back from this, but you're talking about back-to-back games with at least 11 penalties for the Texans, so that is maybe of slight concern. But sort of circling back here to the Vikings, that, I think that when you ultimately look at sort of how this all shakes out for them, we know the NFC North is a very tough division, with the Packers and the Lions really being the main 2. Now, I had expectations for the Bears coming into this season, and we'll probably dive a little bit more in depth into Caleb Williams and that game later in the week here. But that being said as well, I think that they have shown flashes of being able to be better than the product they're currently putting out there on the field, but they're not ready yet. And that is almost going to be a little bit more of a window that is open for them moving forward. And they're going to start their divisional play this upcoming week on the road in Lambeau. Still TBD on whether or not Jordan Love is actually going to play. I think it's possible. The Packers have sort of alluded that he could be in these past couple weeks, but ultimately, I had no faith that he was going to be able to play in either of these last 2 games. The initial timeline that Ian Rappaport put out there was about 3 weeks headed into coming out of that season opening game. So this would be around there, and versus Jordan Love in Lambeau would be the real test for them, I think. But again, I said that this upcoming weekend against the Texans was going to be a test too, so it would be disingenuous of me to sort of just keep kicking the can down the road. Now, that being said, I'm not going to sit here because of these 3 games and now fully say the Vikings are Super Bowl contenders and that they are, set for the future. But really what I think the importance of all of this is that Kevin O'Connell is running such a well-coached system. Brian Flores is, I think that he's an excellent coach, and he's continued to show that every time he's gotten a chance as a defensive coordinator. Now, with all of the Tua news and sort of that situation, I don't know if this is the offseason that he's going to be able to get another head coaching opportunity. He might be interviewed in one or two places, and I think that momentum is going to start to build up. But I feel like that means, a great sign, especially if Flores does hang around for at least another year. And it's going to be a great sign for once J.J. McCarthy is in town long term. And, I've had people in my life ask me about the idea of, well, do the Vikings just stick it out with Darnold for here? If you can come to a mutually agreed upon deal where maybe it's a 1-2 year deal for Darnold and have him continue to be the bridge into next season, it's in play. It would require Darnold, by the way, in this hypothetical, to continue to be playing at the level that he is throughout the rest of the year. So again, TBD there, but I feel like Darnold is probably going to play his way into getting a contract somewhere else. There are a couple other teams where they, are going to be in need of a quarterback. The two teams that really stand out to me that could potentially look into spending. I think the number one destination would be the Titans, because Will Levis, I have a very hard time believing that he's going to continue to be a starting quarterback in the NFL all that much longer. You could maybe throw the Raiders in there, but they also gave Gardner Minshew a 2-year deal, so I'm not totally sure there. I mean, Carolina's a team, obviously, that is going to be in need of a quarterback, but I don't think that Darnold is going to go there. So again, it's way too early in the season right now to be talking free agency and where he could end up. But, I think that Darnold could potentially come back to Minnesota. Minnesota is in a very good place moving forward here, and they have to feel good about where they currently stand, both in the standings today and in the vision of what they are long term. Because ultimately, if they make a run towards the playoffs this year, that will be great for building a culture. I don't think that anybody is seriously going to be picking them to come out of the NFC. That's never what this season was about. That just continue to build momentum. That's all you can really ask for the Vikings at this point. You're playing with house money a little bit, and you just got to try and continue to build off of that, which I think they are very capable of doing so based off of where they're currently at. But I did just mention the name of the Carolina Panthers, and they are in a situation where you don't feel good about their infrastructure whatsoever, really, but you do feel really good about what Andy Dalton was able to show, and in turn, maybe feel a little bit better about just how bad the roster situation there is in Carolina. So I want to dive into that because I think it is a fascinating conversation of Andy Dalton coming in and lighting the NFL on fire in his first game, in replacement, of course, as well, of Bryce Young. So we're going to be diving into that. But before we do so, we have to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere, and we will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where I want to dive into what was in large part one of the biggest surprises of the weekend, and that was the Carolina Panthers going into Las Vegas and just balling out, and specifically a certain red-haired quarterback in Andy Dalton becoming the first player in the NFL so far this season to throw for over 300 yards and 3 or more touchdowns, which I can't imagine who had that on their bingo card headed into the season, but what a performance from Dalton. And this is a win where you got to give credit to Dalton, who obviously comes in off of the bench, the veteran who really hasn't played much football in the past couple years and was just ready from the jump in this game. But it led to the entire offense actually looking competent. And as much as it was Dalton and, the 300 yards there and the passing touchdowns there, the running game looked revamped. It seemed like there was more push from the offensive line. Chuba Hubbard finishes this game 21 carries for 114 yards. The receiving core, Deontay Johnson, a career high in receiving yards with 122. Added to that, 8 catches for a touchdown. So this was night and day from what we saw from Carolina's offense for really since the beginning of 2023 up to this point. Now, obviously, this all coincides with Bryce Young, and this feels like it is a good amount of an indictment on him. And I think it's a couple different things. You do have to take into consideration the fact that Bryce Young, he was clearly still sort of seeing ghosts from last season, that when he was thrown into the fire then, it was a worse situation, I think all things considered, than what Carolina has now. Their offensive line is a little bit more put together. The Panthers this past offseason invest into 2 starting guards at very high prices in Damian Lewis and Robert Hunt to be able to shore up that push in the beginning. Bryce Young, somebody who already is on the smaller side, you're going to need blockers in front of you, and he didn't really get that in 2023. But that being said, it is pretty bad to see from what the Panthers were these first couple weeks of the season to this week, where now you sort of look at the overall situation and listen, the Panthers are not going to now all of a sudden be this team that is consistently, I'm thinking at least that they're not going to be able to put up 36 points a week. That they did also sort of benefit from playing a Raiders team that I just don't think that the Raiders are all that good. I think that win against the Ravens is going to be, looked at as one of the biggest flukes of the regular season. But, we'll see on that, TBD. But for the Panthers here, you got a pretty good rushing attack. Chuba Hubbard looked as good as he did. And, Deontay Johnson, I know that it's a little bit lackluster, but, Deontay Johnson, in terms of yards, generally speaking, I know that he obviously went on the massive drought in terms of actually catching touchdowns through the entire 2022 season that seeped into 2023. But Deontay Johnson is somebody who can, on a regular basis, get you in the realm of 1,000 yards. Maybe that's overstating it a little bit, but I don't think it's off. I think that he's been playing on some really bad Pittsburgh Steelers offenses these past couple years and still has put up 700, 800 yards. That now if, he's the number 1 wide receiver in maybe a situation that's a little bit more serviceable in Carolina. And it's still so crazy to say. Listen, Andy Dalton could come back and turn into a pumpkin next week, and I don't think that it would shock anybody necessarily. But I feel like now, Dave Canales has been an excellent play caller up to this point, which is what led to him having such a meteoric rise towards becoming the head coach of the Panthers. That, he's made his way with the offensive mind that he has, that now if he just knows that he can get a little bit more stability, it's not like the Panthers aren't without any targets, where you do have Adam Thielen, who got injured. I don't know what the severity of that is, so, we'll see on whether or not Thielen's there, but you draft Xavier Legette, a very talented wide receiver out of South Carolina, at the end of the first round as well. That there are Jonathan Mingo, somebody that, I think is probably more so leaning towards they reached on that pick, a second round pick from 2023. That's the thing, is the Panthers have been investing into trying to shore up the offense around the quarterback position to the point where, I think that there is a world that Bryce Young could find his way again. I don't know if it would be with Carolina, but if he can sort of get rid of all of the bad tendencies and seeing ghosts to some degree that he was in these first couple weeks of the season, I mean, that Chargers game especially, I think, was just such an indictment on him. And this entire situation is very tough for the it's all on Carolina's fault party. I was somebody who I was somewhere in the middle where, yes, it was a bad situation in Carolina as he came into it. I never loved the idea of trading your number one target in order to go get your quarterback of the future. Feels slightly counterproductive. Basically, anybody else on the roster, go for it. But kind of need somebody for this guy to throw to. But, it can be a bad situation. And Bryce Young can just be not that great of an NFL quarterback. He never really had the size that made it feel like he was going to comfortably be able to thrive. That it's not like he has necessarily an elite skill set in terms of arm talent or accuracy or precision. It's sort of more on that decision making energy, can be a little bit crafty outside of the pocket at times, but it's not like he's going to consistently be ripping off 50-yard runs for you. That I think it is somewhere in the middle again, where we can admit Carolina did a bad job of bringing him along, but this one just might be on Bryce Young as well. And I do feel for him very seriously, because I think that being in the conversation of, especially in the NFL, where you're the quarterback, your entire franchise basically revolves around you, that you are going to have all the pressure in the world, all the eyes in the world on you, that not being able to live up to expectations there is being put in an extremely difficult position. And that's on the Panthers for taking him there. But also, to the crowd of people, and you can be a Bryce Young defender and also recognize, I've seen a number of people make the argument, well, if CJ Stroud was drafted by Carolina, he would do no better. Well, he wouldn't have the season that he did, the historical rookie season, like he did in Houston last season. But to say that he wouldn't do any better is probably a bit disingenuous, because you look at last season too. It was drafting Jonathan Mingo. It was bringing in some targets that, not super high level, and Adam Thielen, Miles Sanders. They signed Hayden Hurst at the time. I understand that is, mid-level talent. It's not something that you should, be patting them on the back so heavily for, but it's not like they had entirely, completely omitted what was needed around the quarterback position. And I just feel like it's in a situation here where, we can all be rooting for Bryce Young, but it might be it. I think that this series of events the past 2 weeks, that Chargers game was horrendous for him. And to see the offense have as much success as they did, a total of 437 yards without him for an Andy Dalton that, started one game in 2023 and, now at this point is 36 years old. It's a really bad look. So I don't know. I'm sure behind the scenes, the Panthers are going to try and work with Bryce Young to at least get him somewhat back on track. I don't think that the plan for the Panthers is going to be starting Andy Dalton for 15 games of their 2024 season. That is a pretty tough situation to back yourselves into. But that being said, Andy Dalton was phenomenal for them yesterday. And if you can give that type of production on a regular basis, then all power to you. Dalton deserves to have the job moving forward here. But I don't know if that's necessarily a realistic outcome for them. Shots Below the Belt here in the comment section asks, is there any trade value for Bryce Young after benching him? The reality is, like, at this current point, no. And I think that there would be really no point in the Panthers trying to field calls for him, because you're talking about somebody who has, the lowest amount of trade value at this current moment, that this has been rock bottom up to this point. Now, if other teams inquire and are willing to, give up a more substantial pick, I can't imagine the Panthers would be able to get anything more than a fifth round pick. I mean, Justin Fields went for a conditional 6th this past year. He's probably going to be a 4th rounder based off of the clauses of how much playing time he gets. But, Justin Fields being a 4th rounder, we saw Kenny Pickett, who at least started competently more games than Bryce Young did, which is, that went for a 6th round pick this past year, that I think it's going to be really hard to move off of Bryce Young. Now, there are teams out there like the Titans maybe, or maybe the Raiders that maybe could take a spin on him. Well, I think the trade idea that I've liked the most up to this point is the Rams trying to get their hands on him to sort of have him grow up a little bit more under McVay and under Stafford, and having that be a succession plan. As Shots Below the Belt asks, is there a height requirement for a quarterback in the NFL? If there were, Bryce Young would be walking that line, because that's the thing, is he just doesn't have any outstanding physical tools to his repertoire, that it's really more so about the mental part of his game, which isn't really there up to this point either. So extremely difficult situation for Bryce Young. I wish for nothing but the best for him. I also love me some Andy Dalton. So if we're going to get Andy Dalton balling out on a regular basis here moving forward, I am so game for that. But I would also, whoever's starting at quarterback, there is potential. That's what we saw. Even if it's against the Raiders, who I don't think are a great team, there is a potential. We have now seen it with our own eyes of this Panthers offense being functional, that whoever it is, I think that, I just want to see the Panthers actually, they're such an eyesore. That's what they were the first 2 weeks in each of their blowout losses. They were hard to watch, and it doesn't have to be that way, very clearly. As I mentioned, I've been a little bit of a Deontay Johnson fan. I think that he gets a lot of flack for playing in a bad offense. Glad that he's now hoping to get an opportunity as a fantasy football owner. Very excited to see him maybe have some value as well. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to all of you who are using the comment section. We really appreciate your input as well, and we like to make this show a little bit more fun and interactive as well. Get comments like from Shots Below the Belt talking about get Bryce Young a step stool in the pocket. Always fun to interact with you guys here as well. But again, that is all the time we have for today. So we will be back tomorrow afternoon, same time as always at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern. We'll be reacting to the 2 Monday Night Football games from tonight, and we will be breaking that down. Remember to follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us, and be sure to check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content. We will see you tomorrow. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.